We are here again on the trail. We are going to combine what you've learned about primary and secondary sources and about the Oregon and Santa Fe Trail, and we are going to make that into one great learning experience. So let's get started. After today's lesson, you will be able to create a primary source, and you will recall important details about the Oregon and the Santa Fe Trail. Let's recap. I know sometimes it's hard to remember after you've been learning so much and in this different style of learning. So, summarizations of the Santa Fe and the Oregon Trail. If you look here on the left side, the Oregon Trail happened from 1850 to 1869. It took at least 4 months to travel if everything went well. It was about 2,000 miles long. Settlers took the trail because they were looking for a better life with land and opportunity. They faced lots of challenges, including disease and starvation. They also traveled in groups of people called wagon trains. So they would line up their wagons and they would travel together because it was safer to kind of do that as a team. Looking at a much different trail that went through Kansas, the Santa Fe Trail, it happened between 1821 and 1880. So it actually started before the Oregon Trail. It took about 8 weeks to travel and was only 900 miles long, compared to the Oregon Trail that's much shorter, about half the distance and half the time it took to travel. It was considered the prairie highway and used for transporting goods to and from different sides of the country. So they would start there in Independence, Missouri, and then they would travel all the way to New Mexico, Santa Fe, New Mexico. These travelers also faced many challenges, including starvation and robbers. And remember, once they hit New Mexico, they would come back to Independence, Missouri, taking goods to and from. That's why they called it the Prairie Highway. So that's a quick summarization. Feel free to pause the video here if you would like to look over those a little bit slower. You really want to have those details in your mind. These are some things they saw on the trail. On the Oregon Trail, they saw Chimney Rock. Remember that? They said that looked like a big, like a potato with a stack on the top of it, and it looked like a chimney, so they called it Chimney Rock. They also had Courthouse Rock, and with Jailhouse Rock right next to it, another huge rock. Independence Rock was a huge mound where they would often write their names. It's kind of like a rite of passage. We've made it this far on the trail, and you can still see some of those names today. Devil's Gate was a crack in some rocks that was too narrow to pass through, but so travelers had to go south and around Devil's Gate. But again, it's another landmark that people would know where they were at and how far they had traveled. There were lots of forts there on the Oregon Trail where you could stop and you could trade, but goods cost a lot of money when you stopped there. And so you had to have a lot of money in order to trade or to buy, and so it was not made for everybody. There were also large and small rivers and streams that they had to pass through or over, and sometimes they cost money for a ferry to pull you across. Sometimes they forged it, and if they were to get their supplies wet or fall off of their wagon, they lost it. So that was a very dangerous thing they had to do. Also, thinking about the weather, sometimes those streams and rivers would start to ice over. The Santa Fe Trail, there were forts also where you could trade. The Spanish Peaks were those two mountains where at one point there were rumors to have had gold. The Pawnee Rock, which is in Kansas, where settlers would camp out, so they had kind of a lookout to make sure nobody was coming to rob them and steal the goods that they were transporting on the trail. And Wagon Mound, it was that huge rock that kind of looked like a wagon with oxen pulling it. So those are some things. If you need to go back and look at your assignments from last week to kind of get those pictures in your head, you could also Google these things. Feel free again to pause and kind of go over what they look like, because you'll need to know both the summarization of the trails and some sites on the trails. Moving on, we are going to recap about primary and secondary sources. Remember, a primary source is evidence created by someone at the time of the event. It's happening right now. So letters and diaries, government records, autobiographies, which is a book written, it's your story written by you. An artifact, like for example on the Oregon Trail, maybe a shoe that a child wore, or a bonnet that someone wore, or maybe a piece of a wagon, that would be an artifact, or computer software. Secondary sources are information created by someone who was not there when the event happened. So a newspaper article about something that happened in the past or earlier that day that I was not present for. A textbook, a biography, which is about somebody's life, not your own life, but somebody else's life, an encyclopedia, a dictionary, and an atlas. Those are all secondary sources. Let's look at a couple of different primary sources. Fourth graders, I loved this one here on your right. This is a map created in 1846, and it was part of the Oregon Trail. So when they got there, you can see that this, in very small print, says Oregon, and that's what the state looked like at the time in 1846. I also want to pull up some journal information. I thought this was quite amazing. So what you're looking at here is a document. It's an agreed upon text that these people would pay this much money to help establish a school. So it says, we, the undersigned, agree to pay the following sums annexed to our several names within 6 months for the purpose of purchasing lumber, windows, nails. I can't quite read this word, for the purpose of completing schoolhouse in district number 21. So this was a legal signing contract where these people signed their names, and they said this is how much money they would pay in order to help build a school. So that's a pretty neat thing. I don't see the date on this, but it came from a government website, so I know that this is a great site that actually has legitimate information on it. I also want to pull up what you're looking at here is a journal entry that was transcribed, and then they printed it out so it'd be easier for us to read. And again, this was a government website, and this is somebody that was actually on the Oregon Trail. So this is a primary source because this person was there when it happened, and they wrote this down like in their journal. I'm going to read some of it to you, but I won't read all of it. And as I'm reading it to you, I want you to think about, how does that make you feel? How is this a different experience than just reading a textbook about what's happening? So I'm going to start right here at before. Feel free to follow along with me. Before we reached Oregon City, my father was fortunate enough to buy 2 pounds of butter. The hungry crowd was so great that before we smaller ones had our turn at the improvised table, the butter had all been eaten up. There were 6 of us smaller children who did not get a taste of butter, and the thought of that rankled in us for years. It was my duty to keep up the loose stock in the crossing plains, and I was given charge of an old sorrel mare who had one eye. Her name was Shuttleback, on account of her shape of her back. She was a big, powerful animal, and when she'd get a whiff of an Indian, she would kick and plunge, and many times would throw me off. One day we had traveled long in the heat, and both Shuttleback and I needed water. I was about a middle behind the train, and off at the side of the road in a grove of willows was growing. It looked like water might be there. There was a little tributary of the Snake River, so I gladly got off the saddle and had no horn on it, and first let the mare drink. It was a steep place. The mare began to plunge, and I soon saw she was in quicksand. I held tightly to her rein, yelled with all my might, knowing there was a man behind me also driving stock. He heard me, rushed to my assistance, telling me to hold on and not be afraid. He would bring help. He rushed ahead and brought back my father and 3 other men, and with ropes, a long pole, they pried her out of the quicksand and floated down the stream, where she finally landed on her feet. So 4th graders, to me when I'm reading this, I can imagine what this girl was feeling. Here she is, a young child, first of all, who wanted butter, which sounds like something maybe we might take for granted, but to her that was a big deal, and she didn't get it, and it said for years she remembered that feeling. She also tells an experience about how her horse got stuck in quicksand and how scary that was and what happened to get her out of that situation. We could have read that from a secondary source, but reading it from a primary source helps us to understand the feelings of what was happening right then at that time. So going back to our lesson, you are now going to be creating a primary source. You're going to pretend that you are a pioneer on one of the trails, whether that be the Oregon Trail or the Santa Fe Trail. You're going to create a journal entry. So when you do that, I would like you to include the date and location, who is you're with and who is around you, how you're feeling and why, what you saw, so maybe some of those landmarks or sites, rumors that you've heard from others. So maybe somebody in your wagon party said something, Or maybe you stopped at a fort and somebody gave you a rumor about what to expect coming up. And maybe again some landmarks you saw. Up here, when I said what they saw, you could talk about cattle or wild animals or maybe Native Americans. Think about the language they would use. If you need to go back in this video and review the summarization, so you have dates, you have travels, you can also go back here and look at some of the landmarks to freshen yourself up. But your journal should include all of these things. All right, great job, fourth graders listening today. I cannot wait to read these. Be creative, have fun with it. You are a pioneer. Put yourself in their shoes and create a pretend primary source. Thank you.